founder of CASA, welcome you all to this exciting international webinar on the Quad, which we have titled Contours of the Quad in the New Paradigm. We are holding this webinar jointly with the International Security Industry Council, ISIC Japan, which is a non-profit corporation registered in Tokyo to promote business-to-business collaboration between the Japanese industry and global defense companies in like-minded countries, whose purpose is to foster relationships between stakeholders, that is the corporates, government and NGOs, military and academia, focused on SMEs with limited budgets and experience. CASA is an independent body, mostly of very senior veterans, about 60 3-stars, 2-stars and 1-stars of the Indian Armed Forces, scholars and enthusiasts committed to sharing, analyzing and discussing issues of national, regional and international importance, thereby helping shape the national discourse on strategic issues. We work pro bono in an informal manner and are not a registered think tank. For today's webinar, we have a very distinguished lineup. Our moderator is Lieutenant General P.R. Shankar, PVSM, AVSM, VSM, retired Professor Aerospace Department, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Our speakers are Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, AVSM, VSM, retired, Director General, National Maritime Foundation, Lieutenant General Jerry Martinez, retired, former Commander, US Forces, Japan, and the 5th Air Force, Pacific Air Forces, Vice Admiral Yoji Koda, retired, former Commander-in-Chief, Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force Fleet, Professor John Blaxland, International Security and Intelligence Studies, Australian National University. And our special guest for this webinar is Dr. Eugene Kuo, Director of the Institute of Policy Research, INPR, Taiwan. I would like to say a few words about our panelists. Lieutenant General P.R. Shankar is a retired Director General of the Indian Artillery. He is an alumnus of the National Defense Academy, the Defense Services Staff College, the Army War College, the Naval Postgraduate School, Monterey, and the National Defense College, New Delhi. He has held many important command, staff, and instructional appointments in the Army. He has vast operational experience, having served in all kinds of terrain and operational situations, including counterinsurgencies which have confronted the Indian Army in the past 4 decades. A highly decorated officer, he gave great impetus to indigenization and modernization of the Indian artillery. He was instrumental in the induction of guns like the Dhanush, the M777 ultralight howitzer, the Sharang, the K9 Vajra, as also the Pinaka, BrahMos, the Grad BM21 systems. He has deep knowledge, understanding and experience in successful defense planning and acquisition. He was also instrumental in putting systems in place to ensure that the deficiencies in the artillery ammunition were made up. He was associated with the initial development of the Agni and Prithvi missile systems, having worked under the late Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, Lieutenant General Vijay Sundaram, Dr. VK Saraswat in the DRDL Hyderabad in the 80s. He was recently a member of the committee to involve a long-term technology perspective plan of the DRDO. The general officer now is a professor in the Aerospace Department of IIT Madras. He is actively involved in applied research and advises the Tamil Nadu government in the development of the defense corridor. He has written over 250 articles in strategic affairs, defense planning, defense technology, and blogs at www.gunnershot.com. He is a member of the Chennai Center of China Studies and a co-founder of CASA, which, as you all know, is a virtual think tank on current and strategic affairs. Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, AVSM and BAR, VSM retired, Director General of the National Maritime Foundation of India. He is an alumnus of the National Defense Academy, the Defense Services Staff College, the Naval War College, and the National Defense College, with a BSc, MSc, and MPhil degrees under his belt. He is now the National Director General, National Maritime Foundation, which is India's foremost resource center for development and advocacy of strategies for the promotion and protection of India's maritime interests. The Admiral has a rich and varied naval career, which has included a 3-year deputation to the government of Mauritius, where he set up and commanded the Mauritius National Coast Guard. He has been a principal evaluator of the Navy's battle tactics, the head of the naval training team at the Defense Services Staff College, and the principal director of naval operations. His seagoing service incorporates command appointments on 4 occasions, culminating in his command of India's aircraft carrier, the Virat. As flag officer, he was Navy's first Assistant Chief of Naval Staff, Foreign Cooperation and Intelligence, where he conceptualized and executed the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. As Vice Admiral, he's been Chief of Staff of the Western Naval Command and was, in his last appointment before retirement, the Commandant of the Indian Naval Academy. He's been commended 3 times by the President of India for his sustained distinguished service. He's on the visiting faculty of higher command establishments of all 3 India's defense services and tri-services establishments. He's also been advising the government through his interaction with the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of External Affairs, the National Security Council Secretariat, and the Joint Intelligence Committee. He's a prolific writer with over 85 published professional articles and papers, a respected advisor, and a fellow of several important think tanks, including the Ananta Aspen Center, the Forum for Strategic and Security Studies, and the Center for Advanced Strategic Security Studies. Lieutenant General Jerry Martinez, former commander of the US Forces of Japan and commander of the 5th Air Force Pacific Forces, the senior-most US military representative in Japan. He was responsible for managing bilateral security issues, overseeing joint/bilateral exercises, administering the status of forces agreement, improving combat readiness, and enhancing the quality of life of 60,000 military and Department of Defense civilian personnel and their 42,000 dependents. General Martinez was commissioned in 1986 as a graduate of the US Air Force Academy. He is a command pilot with more than 4,000 hours in military transport aircraft, who previously commanded the 62nd Airlift Wing, overseeing the Air Force only prime nuclear airlift force. His staff of assignments include Deputy Chief of Staff Operations, Headquarters Allied Joint Force Command, Brunsum in the Netherlands, the Chief of Joint Mobility Operations Center at the US Transportation Command, Secretary of Defense Corporate Fellow with the DuPont Corporation in Wilmington, Delaware, and the Inspector General Headquarters of Air Mobility Command. Prior to his current assignment, he was Director of Operations, Headquarters Air Mobility Command in Illinois. Our next speaker, Vice Admiral Yoji Koda, retired as a graduate of the Japan Defense Academy, 1972, the JMSDF Staff College, and the US Naval War College. As a surface officer, he took command of JS Sawayuki and the Fleet Surface Force at Sea. His short duties included Director for Strategy, Plans and Operations, Maritime Staff. He retired from JMSDF as Commander-in-Chief of the Self-Defense Fleet in 2008. Then he researched China's naval strategy at the Asia Center, Harvard University from 2009 to 11. He has served as an advisor to the National Security Secretariat of the Government of Japan for 2 years until March 2016. He is an advisor to the Japan Marine United Corporation now. Dr. John Blaxland is Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies, former head of Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University, and a former director of ANU Southeast Asia Institute. He's a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy, the fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales, and a member of the editorial board for the Australian Army Journal. He has extensive experience in academia and government service as an Army intelligence officer. At ANU, he researches and writes about intelligence, cybersecurity, Australian military history, strategy operations, defense studies, and international security affairs. He has a number of publications to his credit. He also teaches undergraduates and postgraduates on intelligence and security. In addition, he teaches in the Master of Strategic Studies and the Australian Command and Staff College programs, and supervises several PhD students. He also advises the parliamentary committees and an occasional commenter on the media. Our final speaker for the evening, Dr. Eugene Kuo, is Professor China and Asia Pacific Regional Institute at the Sun Yat-sen University. Dr. Kuo is currently a member of the Advisory Committee of the Continental Commission, a consultant to the Straits Exchange Foundation, and Vice President of the Institute of Contemporary Japanese Studies. He was a researcher at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Tokyo, a visiting researcher at the Japan Institute of International Studies, and a member of the Japanese Research Center at the National Sun Yat-sen University. On occasion, Dr. Kuo has given speeches at the US Department of State's Foreign Affairs and Consular Training Institute and the Japan Defense Ministry, and has participated in numerous panel discussions on security issues and in the Asia Pacific region. He was awarded in 2015 the Special Young Scholar Award, and in 2017 for Academic Research Excellence Award by the National Sun Yat-sen University. His areas of research include US-Japan relations and military alliances, Japan defense policy, and the defense industry. Without further ado, I now hand over to our moderator, General P.R. Shankar, to conduct the proceedings of this webinar. Thank you. Over to General Shankar, please.
Thank you, sir. A very good day to all the panelists and all those who are listening and watching this webinar from across the world. It's indeed an honor to be moderating such an eminent panel. The world, as you know, is on the cusp of a change, and that change is being driven by China. And at the outset, I must also thank the People's Republic of China for having got us onto this platform together. Having thanked them, let me lay down a few ground rules for today's event. After this, I'll request each speaker to give his views out for about 10 minutes. Since we are going to be a little tight on time and the views are many, at the end of 8 minutes, we'll give a reminder to the speaker so that he can wrap up in the next 2 minutes. Once all the 5 speakers finish their putting out their views, we'll pose them one question each, which I'll pick up from the questions which you asked or which I have with me, or from their speech. And then we'll give them a couple of minutes to expound their views on that particular issue which we raise. Thereafter, we will have some time left where we will still go ahead and pick up questions from the audience and pose it to that speaker whom you wish to put it across. Right. Having said this, the Quad, the concept of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe long back, he conceptualized it and it collapsed. Then the second coming was there in last year, and it also came to a level where it was, much in the air. Then somehow at the end of the last year, when the US elections were due and things were on, many of us in India felt that it's going to collapse again. And how will this Biden administration, take it forward? Much to the surprise of all of us, and that's how we started this seminar and the webinar as a concept. How do you think this Quad will go? Much to the surprise of all of us, the Biden administration, within 1 month of coming into office, has kick-started the Quad all over again. And very recently, as you know, the Quad foreign ministers met. And I think Quad is on a very fast track compared to what our concept was even a month back. 2 issues of this foreign ministers meet which we need to understand. One, for the first time, the foreign ministers' press release mentioned it as Quad. The word Quad has come into the lexicon. Second, if you look at the press release of the Japanese Prime Minister or the Japan's Foreign Office, you see for the first time, China has come into the lexicon by name, right? Which is a portent of things to come, right? So there is a definite move ahead. At the same time, when you look at the Quad, it composes of 4 strong democracies, 4 good economies, one of the top 20 economies of the world, and there's a lot of potential here. At the same time, each country has its own interests, its own issues, and what it brings onto the table, And there are issues which we have, rough edges which we have to get across. And that is the whole story of this webinar, that besides the government, let some of us get together and see what are those rough edges, put our views across so that we can put it back to our different governments and come on to a common platform to fight or to contain a common adversary. With this, I request Admiral Pradeep Chauhan to take off and expound his views from an Indian perspective. Over to you, Colonel Admiral Chauhan.
Thank you very much, General. Thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity. I have somewhat limited time available, so I will try and proceed as rapidly as I can, making do with staccato rapidity to make up for some compression of time. I want to explain my perspective of how India actually approaches the Quad and what we expect from it, and how we might be able to contribute to it. Every country, and India is no exception, has a set of geopolitical sort of constructs, and ours involve both geo-economic goals and non-geo-economic goals in common with every country. And then we have a set of geostrategies that we evolve and formulate and execute in order to obtain those to attain those geo-economic objectives and the non-geo-economic objectives, in which are included things like, the latter includes things like people-to-people contact, cultural connections, and so on and so forth. What is our aim? The aim of the country is really discernible along two tracks. Both of them start from a point of confluence and end at a point of confluence, and the Quad sits in the middle like a sphere around whose periphery both these trajectories will move. So the most important element of our strategy is the need for India to knit this region together. By the region, I really mean the Indo-Pacific together. And within the Indo-Pacific, as a start point, we obviously would focus upon the Indian Ocean region as an immediate aim. So knitting this region together allows us to actually bring economic prosperity to the region as a whole, produce engagements that are mutually beneficial along a win-win path as envisaged and as articulated by the vision of Sagar, the prime ministerial utterance for security and growth for all in the region. And that then defines our overarching aim. Now, within that, we have two trajectories, as I said, both of which lead to the Quad. The first of them is India as a postmodern society, as a postmodern force structure, where the aim is to protect the global commons, within which the maritime common is of particular importance, and while protecting these global commons and the maritime common, to provide and to contribute to the provision of public goods. Now, this business of provision of public goods automatically requires that there be a stable and a rules-based order in which the rules are not decided in a given country's given capital, but are arrived at through international consensus. And we in India fully recognize the fact that the world has taken a great deal of trouble and a great deal of time and a great deal of effort to arrive at the rules-based order as we know it. Now, what are these rules-based orders? The rules-based order is really those defined by the international confluence of ideas that led to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the conventions leading to the International Maritime Organization, and those structures that generate rules. Rules are also valid for international economic structures. So we are looking to have those rules, which have been derived, as I said, through international consensus, being the base upon which we launch our whole approach and our whole strategy of postmodern constructs within India. And here, I think that one of the really important points I'd like to flag right in the beginning is this business of the Blue Dot Network, which is a US-led initiative in which I personally am very interested because it affords some quality tabs to be put on what otherwise might appear to be simply inexpensive or cheap infrastructure. The other trajectory along which we proceed is that of a Westphalian modern state. Here we have national interests and we have maritime interests. These have been specified and are 9 in number. And once again, we find that these interests, which we seek to pursue, to promote, to protect, all of these interests require, once again, a rules-based order. And our strategy, our country strategy in this whole business, whether you proceed down one or the other of the trajectories, is to actually develop, is to centralize constructive engagement as our main strategy. So we do not believe that we should strike off on our own and tell everybody else who wishes to follow, and those who don't to fall by the wayside. We really believe that it is through constructive engagement that we will be able to approach the aims and the goals that we have, whether they are in geo-economic terms or in non-geo-economic terms. This then leads us to connectivity, all the forms of connectivity, physical, digital, people-to-people, innovative, and so on and so forth. So in both of these, what happens is that the environment that we find ourselves in varies. And obviously it varies between peace and tension and conflict. And one of the causes of tension really is indeed the People's Republic of China, but that, I want to emphasize, is not why India goes towards the Quad, supports the Quad, wishes to contribute to the Quad. It is not about whether this Quad will be able to handle or be able to contain or control or conflict with or confront China. We are going to the Quad because it is in our national interest, whether as a post-modern society or as a Westphalian modern state, to simply knit the region together. And we do not think that there is any better structure that is currently positioned to do so than the Quad. Of course, there are several sub-regional structures as well, but the Quad represents, shall we say, the 4 horsemen of Notre Dame. These are the 4 big players. And therefore, connectivity projects, for example, the Japan, India, Africa, the Asia-Africa growth corridor requires concepts. It requires formulation of policies. It requires constructs. It requires papers. It requires fora in which those papers will be debated. It requires advocacy of common approaches to the development of infrastructure, which is not leading countries into debt traps, into unhappy situations as they many of them find themselves in. But there is quality of both infrastructure and the building of trust. And so I think that between the 4 countries of the Quad, trust and the generation of trust is possibly the Quad's greatest potential output. And therefore, as a maritime power, India fully recognizes that it is through constructive engagement encapsulated by pan-regional organizations and powers such as the Quad that we will be able to move forward. Now, what's the region that we're talking about? All the way from the eastern shore of Africa, all the way across to the western shores of the Americas. We have a number of proposals within this. There is the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative announced in 2019, all of which are capable of being constructively analyzed and constructively pushed by the Quad. So we approach the Quad with great hope. We feel that this is neither is this the Chinese dismissal of the Quad as some sort of froth on the ocean wave, nor is it going to be some form of Asian NATO. I think that the Quad represents a break from Cold War constructs of alliances and an embracing of the present day constructs of, or establishment of alliances by strategic alignments. So
Admiral, 2 minutes.
can do this the best of all, which is what we, at least in my thinking, are looking for and looking from the Quad. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
No, sir, go ahead. You have 2 more minutes. Sorry, that was the 8-minute reminder. Keep going.
Well, I can go on for another 2 hours, but 2 minutes is as good as I can get. And I also want to tell you that, one of the reasons why the Quad is now gaining traction, as General Shankar put it, is because the sheer depth of Chinese penetration, not because China's penetration is per se ipso facto threatening to us, but because the Chinese bring in their wake a revisionist approach to the whole business of the rules-based order. Lawfare has now become a major area of examination, a major strategy being adopted by the Chinese. And lawfare, when applied to the Indo-Pacific, has enormous disruptive potential. We as a country, therefore, are particularly keen that the Quad should debate this, that we should debate what is the difference between a place and a base. What is this whole business of reconstructing islands so as to be able to develop greater and greater maritime zones? If we're going to throw away the uncomfortable provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, will we end up throwing away with the baby with the bathwater? Surely we shouldn't be doing that. Surely, therefore, there should be moderating and moderate influences that seek to restore or sustain a balance of power, not the balance of power, but a balance of power in which the region caters for not just the big boys, but for all, such that comity between nations is respected, sovereignty issues are respected, and nations are not simply trampled underfoot in a barrage of either finance or barrage of military demonstrations of power. And hence, there is a need for us to have some structure that will impose and impose the existing rules-based order and oppose a disruption of that. This is as applicable to the land as it is to the sea. And I think that it is not that the Indo-Pacific is a purely maritime construct, but it is certainly true that it is a predominantly maritime one, and we need to factor that. Now I really will stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, sir. The most important points which I'll take away from you is the fact that you said, spoken of rules-based order, you're talking of constructive engagement, and most importantly, you described the Quad as the 4 horses of Notre Dame. It requires us to be together, right? With this, I'll invite General Jerry Martinez of USA to put forth his views. Over to you, General.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everybody out there from Las Vegas, Nevada in the United States. I want to take a second with you and just kind of provide a perspective from the United States on how we view the Quad. And before you can truly say, the Quad is good or bad, or really understand the premise of how the United States thinks about this, you have to kind of understand the larger, more strategic view of how the U.S. views national security. And in that view, I make a statement here that without doubt, China is the greatest long-term strategic threat to the United States of America. They are our #1 strategic competitor out there. And so we take a look at China and we say China wants 3 things. They want military influence, they want political influence, and they want economic influence globally. And you look at the actions that they're taking, and you will see in each of those 3 arenas that they're conducting different aspects of all of those as we speak, all throughout the planet. And what scares us really in the United States is also the speed at which this expansion of their influence is occurring. If you look back at China, saying around the 2010 timeframe, and then look at where China sits today, and look how much has changed in just those 10 years. You can look at the amount of military spending that's gone through the roof. You can look at the public statements they make, which now show far more confidence and more aggression. You can also look at, many of their actions that show coercion around their neighbors and, trying to put pressure and influence on the neighbors, near the mainland. Their attitude, their philosophies, they haven't necessarily changed in the last 10 years, but what they've become is far more highlighted, far more public, and very aggressive. And that speed at which you see this change occurring is not going to slow. It's not going to slow one bit. It's only going to get faster and faster, and it's going to get bigger. So we do not have the time to sit around and wait for the perfect plan and then say, hey, now we're going to start trying to combat these influences of China. We need to do it right now. We should have done it actually starting in bigger sense 10 years ago. And one of the big aspects of doing that is organizations like the Quad. And you look at a recent Secretary of Defense, Secretary Jim Mattis, who was our Secretary of Defense a few ago. He was the SecDef that said, hey, even though we have US troops that are in combat in the Middle East as we speak, I am going to label the Pacific as the priority area of responsibility for the United States Department of Defense. That was a huge statement. And then you look at how the US is invested in that region already. In Japan, there are 54,000 US men and women in uniform serving in that country. More US personnel in uniform than any other country in the world, foreign country. And then you look at Korea, another 29,000. And then you look at Guam and you look at Hawaii. The United States is invested in the Pacific. And we're not going away. And we can't go away because we are the thorn in China's side in trying to stop the expansion that they so much want. You have to ask yourself, if we're not going to do this now, then when? And I hate to use a cliche statement like that, but when do you start getting aggressive in combating China's expansionism? And as I go back to my point a minute ago, is that we don't have time to sit and wait to start these actions. We view this as very, very crucial. And so within the United States, we're looking at our technology. We're buying and building and deploying technology based on what we think those threats will be in China. You can look at the training that we're doing, and it's very threat-based and Chinese-based to be ready for any type of a conflict, from that perspective. And you can keep going on and on and on. And the point I'm making in all of this is that this is a really big task for the United States, and we need help. Anytime that you can have alliances, you can have a coalition, you can have partners in your endeavors. It's always going to make things better. And you look at the history of the United States since honestly starting about in 1990, where we started with Desert Shield, and then in 91 Desert Storm in the Middle East. And you look at all of the conflicts that we've been in, how we like to have people with us. And certainly for a lot of reasons that makes sense. And so now talk about benefits. So we've said as a nation that we need organizations like the Quad to be successful to manage China. I think the biggest added advantage of having the Quad come together is very simply that it's an added forward deployed deterrence. Instead of, going out and using rhetoric, instead of, things that you see in press statements, what speaks is action. And those actions of having a forward deployed deterrence and having those four nations working together, talking and doing the many other things that go with that is a real message to China. It's a real message, and it's a credible message. And the other thing that it does by having organizations like the Quad is it forces China to have to spread their focus. When they're looking at four different countries and what are those actions every day, and more importantly, what happens when those four countries are coming together? What do those actions look like? That takes a lot of attention. And having more numbers is always better than less in a scenario like that. And what it really amounts to is building some type of a formal resistance versus all of us out there acting independently, trying to resist that expansion. And of course, I can never just underscore the fact that, I use Japan because I'm very, very wed to the country of Japan, having been the commander there. That somewhere around 85% of Japan's oil comes through the South China Sea. And when you look at what China is doing in the South China Sea and what they claim is their, sovereign right to the waters, that has great effect on the country of Japan. And so, we have to take those kind of threats serious. We have to come together, and we have to be able to help the entire region by showing force through numbers. Now, one of the great things that is a benefit of this Quad is very simply of who the 4 countries are that are in it. From a U.S. perspective, what makes this great is that these are 3 of our great friends. Australia, India, Japan, those are really true friends of the United States of America. And it's easy to start, coming in force together, maybe operating militarily together when you're already friends. And very simply, we have 3 things. We have like minds, we have like values, and we have like principles. And when you can get those 3 characteristics and put together with 4 nations, you have a very, very good dynamic. But with this Quad, with these advantages, there's certainly going to be challenges to get to the area, or at least get to the height of performance that we want out of this Quad. And the first area, I think, from a U.S. perspective, is going to be commitment. In the recent Tokyo 2020, at the ministerial level Quad that met, at the end of it, they didn't produce a joint statement. Now, I'm not saying that because you don't produce a joint statement that an organization is incredible or that it can't be good. But I will tell you that when you're dealing with China, there is no halfway. And you have to understand that there is no halfway with China. And so if we want the Quad to be together, then we've got to be committed. We've got to show commitment. We can't be afraid to show commitment, because what commitment equals is credibility. And if you don't have credibility with a force like China, then you're wasting your time. You're truly spinning your wheels. And the second challenge is going to be interoperability. When you bring 4 countries together to work together, you've got political dynamics that you have to figure out. You certainly got economic dynamics. But I look at this also from a military perspective, having lived in that region and having had to deal with China every single day, feeling, touching, and seeing their actions and how those actions hurt those around them. And in order to combat that, then you've got to do things together. You got to do things like share foreign intelligence. You've got to share threat data. You've got to have analytical exchanges. You've got to have joint training and exercises. You've got to have a command and control system that all 4 of us can speak to each other. It will be no good if in some type of a conflict, if we have stovepiped C2 and we can't communicate across the board to all the different forces. And then you also need systems that are able to talk to each other. And so we all have different systems that are developed potentially, in different countries with different types of capabilities. And we've got to understand how we put those systems together in the event that we ever have to work together, and how those systems can complement each other. I can't stress enough that the speed at which China is doing things does not allow us to delay in this endeavor. And then the next challenge is going to be the Biden administration itself. We don't really know where they stand. Now, we've seen a nice, in the opening days of the administration, a nice volley of showing interest in the Quad, which was, I think, very, very important. They've had a lot of rhetoric and tough talk on China, I think, which is important. But, we got to wait and give the administration time to get its footing. They're brand new, and see where they're going to go. I can tell you that when President Biden was the vice president under working with President Obama, China had a tremendous amount of liberty of what they could do in the Pacific. During that period, they got it. Thank you. 8 man-made islands, and so many other things that went on. So yet to be seen how the administration will react. And then in my final statement here is going to be organization. China says that the Quad is an Asian NATO. Well, that's Chinese rhetoric. That's false. I served in NATO. I was the head of operations during the Ukraine and Crimea invasions with Russia. And, we're nowhere near a NATO-like organization yet. But if we are going to be, then it's going to take organization. It's going to take, things drawn out like Article 5 responsibilities. It's going to talk about fiscal responsibilities, legalities, and all of the things that it takes for 4 countries to come together and be in an alliance and be credible. So I'll wrap up by saying we take this threat very seriously. We are a nation that truly believes in help from others. We love help from others. We have 3 other countries here that we greatly respect. And I think using all the countries together with the same passion, drive, and commitment, the Quad could be a fantastic thing. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, General. I think you put things across very clearly. The 2 takeaways I have with me on what you said. First is we don't have time. I think it's a very important thing, and Quad has to move accordingly. And in fact, in my own personal view, that every idea has a time, and the idea of Quad has come, and the time for Quad has come. I don't think we can lose time. The second takeaway from your speech is that USA is not going away from here, right? And without USA being the sheet anchor of Quad, though everyone is equal, the kind of experience which Quad has in, I mean, rather, USA has in leading these alliances, partnerships, whatever you have, is going to be invaluable, and we can't do it alone. And like you also said, and which I mentioned in the beginning, all four of us put together, we clearly outmatch China. We just have to get our act together. Thanks a lot. With this, I'll invite Admiral Koda to give a Japanese perspective on what he feels a Quad should be and where we should go. Thank you. Over to you, Admiral.
Thank you very much. And today I'm going to use I have 5 slides to make my presentation. And this is my thoughts, personal thoughts on Quad. Okay, next please. Yes, Quad is a 4 nations cooperative posture or series of talks, but it still remains as a conceptual body, and it's not an alliance or defense agreement. And last November, as General Martinez mentioned, there was the second Quad Foreign Ministers Conference. And also just a few days ago, there was the online the summit meeting among the Quad leaders. And the objective of Quad is becoming clearer and clearer. And Quad, one important thing is Quad is augmented by other related agreements like the Japan-Australia RAA, this is the Reciprocal Approach Agreement, or Japan-India CASA. So, of course, this is a not hard binding agreement, but the Quad is becoming more and more practical under the very loose binding in the posture. And as everybody mentioned, China is showing a very strong concern or hatred against Quad. But my opinion is, so what? The Quad is ages NATO. What's wrong? And but still, this is also the 2 predecessors already had spoken, that there are many issues for the Quad nations. For example, what is the objective? Or, are there any coordinated policies or strategies toward some countries like China? Not at this moment. So we need to set the objective of Quad very clearly sometime in the future, near future. And also, especially in the military side, we need to enhance the combined warfighting capabilities. Because especially when we invite India to join, this will be very important. And other argument is the what we call Quad Plus, the UK or France or German, the European participations. Will it be good or complicated or easier? But in concept, increasing the number of the nation, the like-minded nation, will be good. But the practical the thinking, not always good. And my last point in my first presentation and the slide is, from Japan's perspective, the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, and Quad form 2 sides of one coin. So, but what is important is those are the maritime community with common value among 4 nations. So one very strong bondage agent is the maritime. I'm not speaking because I was the lazy sailor, but the existence of the Indian Ocean and South China Sea and Pacific Ocean is really the bondage agent for our 4 countries. Next slide, please. And let me use the Chinese A2AD as an example, how we cooperate. I think everybody understands objective of Chinese A2AD is simply keep US forces out from Indo-Pacific region. And key is without fighting, by demonstrating PLA's capability to, I'd say, annihilate US forces if possible. I don't think that will happen, but this is Chinese, the thought. And eventually, they deprive Americans of determination to keep military presence and to fight against China PLA at extremely high cost, and weaken the American people's determination to stay here. If that happens, the world will come to an end. That's the last thing we want. And what are the assets for A2AD? Conventional forces, of course, and new assets like the anti-ship ballistic missile, or what we call the carrier killers, the F-21, 26 test launched on last August, or hypersonic missiles like the F-17, and others, sat killers, or sea-based cable network distractions. There are many other assets China would employ and deploy. And those assets would be supported by the Chinese high-tech like the AI, 5 and 6G, or 5 and 6G communications, quantum computing, cryptology, space, remote sensing, underwater surveillance, and others. So key elements will be high-tech related military assets. And next slide, please. But problem of China is China hates to be surrounded. But by geography point of view, China is already surrounded. To the east, Pacific Ocean; to the south, Indian Ocean and Australia; and to the west, the Indian Ocean and India. And I'm going to show one example from the east, but this is also true to the south and to the west. For example, in case of emergency or military conflict, US forces, of course, stationed in Japan would join, but will be supported by US expeditionary forces coming from west coast of the US or Hawaii to this area. And China would employ first non-conventional warfare. What's that? That's EMP, anti-satellite, cyber, seabed cable network destruction. So this is the kind of the warfare to cut the nerve between the connecting the brain and muscle. And if the US military forces without well-functioning nerve, that would be a sitting duck or sitting ducks. And when the US forces arrives, the line connecting the Tokyo and Guam, China would start employing anti-ship ballistic missile against the US carrier force or marine amphibious ready group or strategic supply groups or hypersonics or conventional forces, submarines or artificial mines, artificial intelligence mines, or bombers with anti-ship missiles. So this is the Chinese concept of destroying or annihilating the US forces if everything goes well, possible. But key thing is how should we cooperate to neutralize Chinese this attempt, okay? But again, I repeat, this could happen to the south and to the west. So China has to do many things to all the directions. Next, please. And also, there's one Achilles heels of China. That is the choke point. At least maritime point of view, China is surrounded by two connecting waters, that the East China Sea and South China Sea, connected by Taiwan Strait. But especially from the Navy operations point of view, there are very few choke points that Chinese fleet or even the Chinese Air Force would be able to use that. One is the Bashi Strait between Taiwan and Philippines, and the second is the Mindanao Passage, south of Mindanao Strait. And the third is Lombok Strait. Those are the only three channels or straits that are deep enough, that means deeper than 100 meters for submarine operations or large carrier force operations. And worse elements than that is there are three other archipelago choke points within the South China Sea. That is Mindoro Straits and Sibutu Strait Passage and Makassar Strait. So especially Chinese submarines or carrier forces trying to get out from Sanya base in Sanya, Hainan Island to the Pacific, their path will be very limited.
Add 1 or 2 more
In
minutes.
the line between Taiwan and Japan, there are several choke points between in Japanese southwestern island. But JSDF will take control. And some may ask question, okay, how about the Malacca Strait or Sunda Strait? Yes, in the peacetime, okay, for commercial trade or military passage in peacetime. But problem of those two straits are very shallow. The depth is only 22 meters. So in a wartime, the submarine cannot pass through as submerged. And of course, China has no control over all of those choke points. So China will definitely has to do many things to take control of those choke points. Without that, Chinese military, robust military, cannot be enabled. So this is the Chinese Achilles heels in terms of geography. Next, please. And this is an idea. Okay, Quad. Of course, this is not an alliance or military agreement, but if we have a capability to coordinate, for example, two straits to the east, Japan, US will be responsible. To the south, including Lombok, Australia and US, and to the west, Andaman Nicobar and Bay of Bengal, India, and perhaps US. And the importance of Taiwan is Taiwan sits just the middle of those island chains. So first island chain is not theirs, ours. And key will be how our four nations would coordinate well without having the strong alliances. This is my point of value of the Quad. Next, please. And this is my last slide. But in the future, China is allocating almost all possible natural resources to develop their own high-tech or high-tech supported military equipment. These are the areas of what we need to do. For example, fleet ballistic missile defense. Chinese anti-ship ballistic missile would fly to the west to kill Indian carriers. We need to develop something. Or integrated air missile defense, especially against hypersonic or irregular trajectory anti-ship missiles. Those are also true to the west, India, to the south, Australia, to big amphibians, or to the east, Japanese ASW carriers and other major assets, including the US carrier forces. And ASW, of course, is very important. Even the 100,000 tons, the Ford class carrier or Nimitz class carriers would sink if Chinese submarine shoot 6 torpedoes and 4 of them would hit the big ship and impose flooding. Iron ship eventually sinks. So we need to develop the modern ASW capability. And one thing forgotten is the recent ages artificial minds. This could be a game changer. And of course, space is very important, especially C4ISR. Without this, we can't fight. And 5th, 6th generation communications, quantum computing or crypto, and seabed cable protections. Those are the areas supported by high techs. And this is where we need to cooperate together. And last slide, my concluding slides. This is the first Malabar in 2007. I was there. Indian Admiral, the Suzanne is there, and Aussie Admiral, the Nigel Coates was there. These are the Fleet Commanders Conference on board US carrier in the Bay of Bengal. We did in the age of the days of Stone Age, long time ago. We need to do this again. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Admiral. That was a very nice presentation which you gave, especially on the geography and the geographical constraints of China from a maritime view, right? If you think the geographical constraints of China are difficult maritime, on the west are the Himalayas, where it's equally bad or even worse. And to an extent, you actually highlighted the terrain constraints of China. And if you look at superpowers, every superpower has had unrestricted, access to oceans, both sides. To that extent, I think the idea of Quad constrains China to a very small pool of the South China Sea, right? And of course, another point which you mentioned in the passing, and which I think is very important, is the amount of ties we've had within the Quad nations. Each country has had a strategic partnership or an alliance with each other, besides being democratic and strong economies and all that. And hence, it is something which we have to build on. It is not that you need to start from the scratch. We just have to put all those bilaterals together and make it into a quadrilateral. Thanks a lot once again. With this, I'll request Professor John Blaxland to speak from Australia and do a Brisbane on us.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, it's a great honor and a pleasure for me to be here with you. This is a fascinating discussion, and I hope I'll be able to add something significant. Look, it's very interesting. The Quad's significance to Australia has increased exponentially in the last few years, and that's really because of what's been happening in the neighborhood. The line of actual control in the Himalayas, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and the clearly more authoritarian streak coming out of Beijing, and the massive investment in their military capability, their conducting of grey zone operations, and wolf warrior diplomacy that has Australia is feeling the sharp end of that, if you like, with their so-called sharp power, as our trade is affected by their quite capricious trade sanctions. What strikes me is that this is a manifestation of that archetypal Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, who 2,500 years ago described the acme of skill being to defeat your adversary without fighting. And clearly, this operation of grey zone tactics, its intimidation, is clearly aimed to get us to back down and to essentially kowtow. And so Australia's really got its back up over this. A lot of people in Australia are quite uncomfortable with the direction China's been taking in the last few years. And the penny seems to have dropped in many minds about this being not something we can just turn our eyes away from, as perhaps we could have in the past. So we're seeing the Indo-Pacific geography feature prominently. I'm just going to share my screen. I don't know if you can hear the cockatoos in the background, but there you have it. There's my screen, and this is my favorite map, ladies and gentlemen, because you have in it Australia hanging off Southeast Asia, but you can see there on the left and right the idea of the Indo-Pacific. India at the top there, Japan on the right, Australia at the bottom, and US territories in between, not so visible because they're coming across very small in terms of Guam's geography there. But essentially you get a sense of the significance of this Quad by looking at this. This is a RAF, Royal Australian Air Force, planning map centered on Darwin, but I've spun it 45 degrees to give you that sense of the significance of the geography. And so I'll stop that sharing now because that's really the main thing I wanted to focus on there. But you get a sense of the significance of geography. But I want to say there's more than just geography at stake. And what we're seeing is that arguably, while the significance of geography has spiked, and Admiral Codd has addressed that brilliantly. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. But we're also seeing the significance ironically, it's declining, particularly in terms of cyber, the cyber domain and the space domain, because those domains are not tied to geography in the way that all of the other domains of air, land and sea power have tended to be. But as we think about India's increased cooperation, it's worth reflecting the contrast. Australia has very close ties with the United States. The ties are deep and broad, and they go back to 1942, when General MacArthur came down to Australia. And the ties actually have deepened over the Korean War, over the wars, the Vietnam, in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. We've been very close, and we're probably as close as we've ever been today. And there's that brings benefits in terms of interoperability, in terms of access to technology and proficiency and the honing of the force. Similarly, we're seeing relationship with Japan deepen on a bilateral level. And that's been in part because of the parallel experiences of Japan and Australia as US allies, the relatively easier interoperability, but a sense of our interests overlapping more so than perhaps ever before. And of course, that's an interesting contrast to our relationship with India, which is, you know, two former British Empire countries, India and Australia. We both love our cricket and we work on our English and, you know, have a common parliamentary systems that actually make for, on some levels, quite easy interchanges because there's a commonality of understanding. Legally, constitutionally, politically, our constructs there are strong parallels that make it easy. So this is the overlap of interests, though, that's emerging more recently is really interesting to see, because we're seeing those cultural factors kind of come to the fore and becoming more facilitating that closer engagement. And for Australia, the increased significance of Indian Ocean security means that managing shifting great power dynamics requires much closer engagement with India. Now, I've conducted what I call a geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia. The SWOT being a business concept where you look at the internal strengths and weaknesses and then external opportunities and threats. And I'll just go back to sharing my screen again, because I have in that spot the idea of this in the bottom right hand corner of great power contestation, looming environmental catastrophe, and a spectrum of governance challenges relating to climate, relating to terrorism, people smuggling, drug smuggling, breakdown of law and order in some of the micro-states in the Pacific and Indian Oceans and that space. Essentially, what this points to is that, yes, China is no question it's the big, you know, dragon in the room. Elephant's wrong metaphor, but it's certainly, it's a major factor. But when we think about the way forward, we actually need to think about the full spectrum of security challenges that we're facing, because I think holistically responding to that spectrum of challenges will actually stand us better for managing things into the future. So where to from here? Well, there are several challenges, and the defense links, we'll start with them. It's my comfort zone. The Navy, we've seen the Indian Ocean focused. Australian Navy, let's be frank, it's small. It's highly proficient, very professional, but it's small. Same with our Australian Army. It's a force of 2 divisions. Now, in the Second World War, we peaked at 14 divisions. We've got 2 at the moment. And Air Force, we've got an Air Force of about 100 fighters and, you know, ancillary supporting EW, electronic warfare, refueling, etc., aircraft. But essentially, that's not a very big force. It's a bit of a boutique force, really. So we need to be thinking cleverly about what we can do collaboratively. And I think there is a space, and Admiral Koda touched on this before, but I think we need to be thinking, if I just go back to my map, I'm sorry to keep doing this to you, but if you go back to the map, you see there that space in Australia's Christmas and Cocos Islands and the Andaman and Cocoa Islands of India at the northern end of the Malacca Strait. So we talk about the Lombok Strait down here, the Malacca Strait. We actually are in a very good position to do some collaboration. between our two countries to add to deterrence. Now, here's the big point. It's about deterrence. But beyond the work of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, I think there's a lot of things we can do on the cyberspace as well, and cyber security. The Australian Cyber Security Centre is within the Department of Defence. It's a growth industry. There's state and federal cooperation, there's industry cooperation, and there's scope for more international cooperation. And I think that's a really useful space for us to think about further collaboration. Similarly, Australia has really doubled down on its engagement in the space industry, and the Australian Space Agency been working closely with NASA for a long time, and with the Japanese Space Agency. But I think there's prospects for deeper collaboration with India in this space as well. Now, I say cooperation and collaboration, not integration. And I think it's important, and we've had Admiral Shankar, General Shankar, I think it was one of the earlier speakers mentioned the significance of this not being NATO. And I think we need to think not about integration so much, but enhanced cooperation. NATO is about mutual defense. Australia has a very close security relationship with the United States. It's actually, there's no clause 5. There's no mutual...
2 minutes to wrap up.
2 minutes. So I think ambiguity about what we do can actually add to deterrence, and particularly over Taiwan. This is the big question, what China's going to do over Taiwan. And there's no question, in my view, that we need to be operating, looking to make it clear to China that it's not a lay down misère. It's not guaranteed that they can just romp it in that space. So just a couple of moments on a couple of the other opportunities. Diplomatically, cooperation with our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade on international legal standards and protocols. I mentioned the looming environmental catastrophe. Humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, crisis response, increased coordination in that space is really useful. But here's another more deeper fundamental question here. And this is about economics, because economics is the heft that underpins national power and military power. And ladies and gentlemen, the United States and India aren't doing enough in this space. No, Australia's not either, to be fair. Japan's trying hard. With the TPP, the United States needs to get back in on the TPP. And in my not so humble opinion, India needs to buy in on the RCEP. We cannot let this ground be dominated by China. And the economics, as I say, it's fundamental. If we want Quad to work, the economics have to undergird it. It can't be security completely separate from economics. We have to make them work together. And then there's a couple of other quick things to note. There's prospects for interagency crisis simulation activities. I love crisis simulation activities. It's what I used to do in the military. I do it with my students at university. There's great opportunity for enhanced collaboration, for relationship building, to think through scenarios in a crisis. And we can do this on Zoom, we can do this virtually, we can do it in person when the COVID pandemic passes. But we need to establish reliable communications, increase standard operating procedures, make sure we have good contact points for coordination and contingency planning, desktop exercises, field training exercises. Just one final point, really important one, extending the Quad. What do we need to do here? I think we need to invite observers to start with, from ASEAN, from NATO, particularly from ASEAN, I'm thinking Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, and from NATO, France, UK, Germany, and Canada. Lots to chew there, folks. Thank you for your attention. I will now hand back to the chair. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor. That was a nice exposition, and your views on RCEP are taken note of, but there is a totally divergent view in India, for which I think we need to work together to resolve this. But then we'll come about that a little later. The 2 points, major points which you mentioned, one is ambiguity. I think it's a very crucial point, because you don't have to be very clear to convey problems to the other person. If you're ambiguous, it's as good as being there, right? Ambiguity carries its own weight. And then, of course, the challenge, the military space is defined, but the outer space and the cyberspace and disaster and climate change are new frontiers which don't have a frontier. And that's where tomorrow's race is on. And that's where a lot more cooperation is required from Quad. Because at the end of the day, Quad has to serve a human purpose. And I think we have a lot of value there and we should take it forward there. Right. With this, thanks a lot. I request Dr. Eugene Ko from Taiwan to expound his views, and then we'll take it forward. Thank you. Over to you, Doctor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Chair. And it's quite an honor to allow me to share some Taiwanese perspectives in cooperation or the current situation in Cross Strait or Taiwan, surrounding Taiwan. And my topic today is I focus on China's salami slicing strategy, as the Chair earlier mentioned. And I provided my PowerPoint, and I'm not going to speak every single slide of my PowerPoint, and you can have the file for your references. Next slide, please. What you are looking at, the map, this is a situation that the Chinese military activities surrounding Taiwan in from year 2016 to 2018. And what you can see, the blue line or dark blue line is their POA Air Force, and brown, orange, and pink lines, those are the Chinese vessels activities. So it's basically China has been imposing salami slicing strategy toward Taiwan, both in the air and in the water. Next slide, please. I'm sorry that because I don't have those maps in English, but as you can see from the map, this one was last year, September 9th to 10th, and that's China's air and sea exercises right in the middle of Taiwan and the Prata Islands. Next slide, please. And this is for the first time, September 18th last year. As you can see, there is a middle line between China and Taiwan. And China was testing Taiwan's reaction when the POA Air Force, their fighter jets, going through the middle line. And the middle line is the consensus between China and Taiwan for decades. So there was, for the first time, Chinese fighter jets trying to test Taiwan's reactions. Next slide, please. And November 2nd last year, that was the first time that China was implementing multiple, the combination of different types of aircrafts exercising in the southwestern ADIZ of Taiwan, carrying cargo plane, patrol plane, EW planes, and fighter jets, as you can see from the map. Next slide. And there were total 380 flights in year 2020 and occupies 95 days that Chinese aircrafts entering Taiwan's ADIZ. And most of the time is to Taiwan's southwestern ADIZ, which is in the middle of Taiwan Island and Prata Island. And as I just mentioned, in late 2020, China increased frequency and different types of exercises, and they are trying to implement different routes of flights. And we are expecting this year, 2021, China's invasion to Taiwan's ADIZ will be like more than 150 days. And the purposes is, those are very simple: testing Taiwan's reaction and to cut off Taiwan and Prata Islands, connections. And the third reason is because that area, air and sea and ocean spaces, is very critical in northern South China Sea for, as Admiral Koda just mentioned, for submarine and anti-submarine exercises. Next slide. So that's starting from this slide is the Chinese invasion to Taiwan's southwestern ADIZ starting from earlier this year. Next slide, please. Those pictures are for your references. So they are basically exercising different types of aircrafts and trying different routes and strategies. Next slide, please. This one too, next. The same, as you can see, this one is a little bit different as their flight route, a little bit closer to Prata Island. Next slide. So that's my perspective on China's Islamic slicing strategy. It has a very important foundation, is a prediction of its opponent's perception and behavior pattern, meaning China have in mind if they try to do something provocative, they have prediction of your reactions and your perceptions of their actions. So there are 3 steps to break current status quo. And second is to create new status quo. And then the third step is legalize and self-justify the new status quo. Next slide. So it actually relating to China has been doing for decades what we call 3 warfares. So the step is actually quite simple: prediction on its opponent's perception and behavior pattern, and second, to test its opponent's reaction and try to break the current status quo. And then once they succeed in the first 2 stages, then it increases China's self-confidence and reinforce their assertive or provocative behaviors. And then step 4 is to create, then they have enough confidence to create new status quo. And step 5 to 7 is relating to this 3 warfare. So China's step 5 is try to legalize and self-justify the new status quo. That's exactly what happened in year 2013 when China established East China Sea ADIZ. And step 6, this evolving psychological warfare, because China has been trying to make its opponent weak and passive. And number 7, step 7 is this is also public opinion warfare, because once China legalized and self-justify its assertive behavior or actions, then it becomes legalized for them and try to persuade other members in the international community. Next slide, please. So the impact of China's Islamic slicing strategy is creating a vicious cycle for its opponents. You know, in East China Sea to Japan, Taiwan Strait to Taiwan, Northern South China Sea to Taiwan too, to make its opponents passive, and second, to weaken and limit its opponents' choices and options, and drag you into attrition warfare, and then making people, especially democracies, anxious, fall into a very anxious decision-making scenario, because it reflects those democratic governments are incapable of handling those China's assertive or provocative actions. Next slide. So those are my observations. I believe China's further slicings toward East China Sea, toward Taiwan, or Northern South China Sea. Number 1, China been enacted and try to implement the new Coast Guard Act at East China Sea, South China Sea, and also very important to Taiwan's Kinmen Island, which is very, very close to mainland China, and also to Taiwan Strait. And number 2 is, I believe this year, 2021, is the 100th anniversary for Chinese Communist Party. And 2022 is the 20th National Congress, which will start Xi Jinping's 3rd term. So my prediction is there is a very high possibility for China to establish Northern South China Sea ADIZ. And if that happens, then Taiwan's Patas Island will be in a very isolated situation. And number 3, China will try to invalidate the middle line of Taiwan Strait, which exists already for decades. Next slide. So,
Dr. Kuo, 2 more minutes.
Okay, the countermeasures, we have to think what China does expect and does not expect from us. And second, to create situations that for China are more loss than gain from its provocative actions. And those thinkings should be non-tactical. It should be strategic. I will use Taiwan and Japan, for example. After China's new Coast Guard Act, Chinese Coast Guard has been trying to implement the act in surrounding Diaoyutai Senkaku Islands. So I think Japan will think again, especially on holding up to this so-called One China policy or One China principle. Try to have coordinated actions with Taiwan. Imagine that if Chinese Coast Guard appear in Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, and as Taiwanese and Japanese Coast Guard vessels appear there, it will surprise China very much. And then next is our reaction is not only thinking out of the box, but also we need to guarantee escalation in our reaction in frequency and the nature. And I don't have enough time, but my following slides are another suggestions to Japan, which I proposed to Japanese government in year 2019 to establish a partner zone for Japan's southwestern island and Taiwan's east coast, because those two areas are like economically backward, but very vital and critical for the security of Japan and Taiwan, and also for the security of First Island chain. I will stop here and thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kuo. I think it was a very nice presentation. I think the critical issue which you put up across is the way China does its salami slicing. Not many outside the South China Sea understand it the way you put it across. For most of us who are not hands-on with China the way you are, salami slicing is a butcher's way of cutting thin slices out of a salami, but not going about in a very definitive way. Thank you. The second thing is what you actually hit upon is or extended the concept of ambiguity or the inambiguity by saying what we should do, what China does or expect or not expect, right? How we handle this as Quad, and not only as Quad Plus and partners and what have you, how do you have to this thing? And I must explain to you and tell everyone, why did we invite Taiwan on this deal? Like Admiral Koda had brought out in his slide, Taiwan is the pivot around which everything moves. If you go into mech warfare in the deserts, you always, the mech forces occupy a pivot of maneuver around which everything goes around and acts. And Taiwan gives you that pivot because it controls virtually, control of Taiwan gives you the control of South China Sea and the East China Sea and on to the open Pacific. So that is why we had Taiwan on board with us. With this, I'll ask you a question. I'd request you to keep it a little short and sharp so that we can go through. And if time permits, we'll take on other questions also. My first question will be to the last speaker, Dr. Eugene Ko. What is it that you expect from the Quad? Now that the Quad is forming, and you're not part of the Quad, but where do you see yourself fitting in the Quad, and where do you think Quad has to look towards you?
Should I answer right now?
Yeah, that's of course there, but if you could, what are your expectations from the Quad is what I'd like to ask.
Okay, I think the initial expectation from Taiwan is at least Taiwan is allowed for information sharing at the Quad platforms, because as all of you know that Taiwan is pretty isolated internationally, And I think at least we should be symmetric in terms of information sharing.
Thank you. My next question is to General Martinez in Las Vegas. We're very clear about the security construct of the Quad, what it should be and where we can go, because we had a lot of cooperation. The question which I have for you, sir, is this. Should Quad go beyond being just a diplomatic and a military construct and go into an economic construct and give an alternative to the other constructs in this area and be a platform for the wider integration of economies, the extra-regional economies like EU and France and UK and all that, and the regional economies with ASEAN and the Quad Plus? Where do we go from there? Because at the end of the day, as President Clinton had once said, it's the economy, you stupid. So, what are your views on that?
Yeah. So the Professor Blackstone, he mentioned about economies and security needing to work together. I think that's a very fair and valid point. But it's also not one that's easily done, in my opinion. You look at the way the NATO works, and you've got these 29 nations that work together. There's certainly economic ties that bind that organization to a degree, but it's really based more on political and military means to produce an end. And so I support bringing economics into the conversation. I think there's great value in it. I think it adds a much better impetus than just purely, political and military. But I do think that it's going to be difficult in an organization that's still trying to figure out what it is exactly, the Quad, and it's a fledgling organization. And as it starts getting more and more, as we say, meat on the bone, it's more legitimate to those around it, then I think you bring economics into that conversation.
So, thanks a lot. I'll get back to Professor Blackstone. You spoke about the RCEP and the need for India to, join hands into the RCEP. There's a prevalent view in India which says we need, apart from not only staying out of RCEP, how does Australia reconcile the dichotomy between the RCEP and Quad and its commitment to the Quad, right? Considering the fact, at the end of the day, economics will play a part in this whole story. Your views, sir.
Yeah, look, wonderful. Thank you for that question. Look, it speaks to an issue addressed in our Australian Foreign Policy White Paper of 2017. Essentially, there's a need for us to be looking to grow the pie. We need to grow the pie, the economic pie, that is. What the size of our economy needs to expand commensurately to keep pace and perhaps outpace potential adversaries. We also need to tie in as best as possible those fence-sitting nations in our neighborhood that are looking and are getting offers for investments from China and sometimes from Japan and elsewhere, but not getting many from Australia and not getting many from India or the United States. I take General Martinez's point about how things have worked in NATO. But the bottom line is that underpinning NATO and the both sides of the Atlantic was economic growth. Both Europe and America grew economically. They were strong economically, and it was from that economic strength that their military strength was postured. My concern is that we are being outpaced. We are being seriously outpaced at the moment, and we need to get our act together. Now, I take the points of criticism about the RCEP, but hiding behind trade barriers, protectionist trade barriers to protect industries that aren't cutting the mustard, that aren't doing their job well enough because of fear of competition, speaks to a deeper problem that our nations face. We need to be working collaboratively to make our nations more robust, to make our nations economically more strongly growing, and to present a favorable economic alternative to simply another Belt and Road proposal. That's what I'm talking about. Now, this is the thing. One of the problems we have with the old notion of the Cold War, and people saying, oh, it's Cold War 2.0, 2.0. I disagree. And it's fundamentally unhelpful to think in that construct. Because when it was the Soviet Union that we were worried about, it was a nuclear armed and nuclear threat that was the principal challenge. China is not presenting that challenge. It is presenting a far more subtle, opaque, hard to pin down challenge, one that reflects a level of intertwining, particularly of the US and Chinese economy, and the Australian one. 40% of our trades with China. We have not been thinking clearly about what this means. So it's all well and good to be talking about the Quad and military and cyber and space cooperation, and I'm a strong advocate for it. But if that's all we're doing, it's not going to get us where we want to be. In the long run, we'll get swamped. That's my concern. So we need to be buying in on the economic side of this equation and thinking outside the box creatively, not in a Cold War mindset, but in a new 21st century mindset about Taiwanese chip industry, microchips, about cyber technology, about 5 and 6G technology, about how we are positioning ourselves for economic prosperity and growth and stability, and not economic being shackled to China as the leader. And that's my concern. We're not doing enough, and we're thinking too, if I can use that metaphor of, we're a hammer looking for a nail. We need to stop looking for the nail. We got to pick up another instrument, not just a hammer. We need the hammer, no question. But if that's all we've got in our tool bag, we're not going to be addressing the challenges of the mid-21st century adequately.
Thank you. I echo your views, because the 4 countries which we have together are a mixture of raw material, consumer power, innovation, and technology, and democracy. I think we need to do a lot more, and that's right. And not only that, beating the pandemic, the climate change, and the space which you brought out. And that, if you look at it, look at the foreign ministers, respective foreign affairs press releases, it's there contained. There were 5-6 points which are non-military in nature, non-security in nature. But I suppose we will eventually move to that place, and we don't have a choice.
Sorry, General Shankar, to interrupt.
Yeah.
We'll stretch this by another 15 minutes. There are a few questions from the attendees also we can take.
Okay. Yeah, we'll do that. Thank you. My question next is to Admiral Koda. How does Japan reconcile to a security grouping of this kind, considering the fact that you have some national laws which will not permit you to, take up the offensive, and we all know it. And how do you handle this kind of a situation? Because that's something which has not come out. Over to you, Admiral.
Okay, can I have 3 hours to answer?
Just give us initial views, yeah.
As everybody knows, the Japanese decision-making, or, the adjusting ourselves to the new security environment is very slow. But at the same time, Japan is making a gradual progress. For example, the new security law in 2015, for the first time, they authorized the Japanese government to exercise the collective self-defense, the authority in a limited case. But this means whenever our ally, like the US or some other foreign forces, are in a real trouble and need Japan's help, we'll go there and fight. Or, in the Taiwan crisis, that's not the Japan crisis, perhaps, but of course, in the real world, self-defense force will be deployed in the Western Island and Western Pacific, and to patrol together, independently. But there are very deep intel exchange or an operational exchange. And this would be extended to the South China Sea. Or another important thing is Japan will play larger games in the Northwestern Pacific, and that will enable and offset US forces to other areas like the South China Sea or Indian Ocean or Gulf. So these are the new areas. So and there is no remedy for Japan because we still have the very, I'd say, the difficult to change constitution. So under that, as long as Japanese people prefers to maintain that one, there is no remedy to change the situation immediately or overnight. But we are making progress, and still not yet tested in a real world situations. But for example, how many our naval ships are passing through the South China Sea next to the US? More than 20 destroyers are passing through the South China Sea a year. Maybe 2 destroyers, 3 destroyers a month. That makes Chinese equation very difficult. And also the very wide and large area ocean surveillance, especially the submarine surveillance, we share the information. And also the Japanese geography, the close proximity to China really helps Japan to get a different type of information. US may very good at space or other, the digital area, but also Japan is very good at some other areas. So that will complement each other. So again, there is no remedy, but really year by year, they enhanced. And more important thing is Japanese people are getting more and more supportive to that new posture.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm not saying excuse, but this is my thought.
No,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. And I think you pointed your finger at the right direction. And it's a matter of how people relook at the whole equation. But thanks a lot for that. And my final question is to Admiral Chauhan. Sir, we've had a history of non-alignment and a different kind of a thinking process. How do we fit into this new paradigm as we go along? What are the challenges you see and how do we overcome them? We don't have 3 hours, but we do have some time for your views, sir. Over to you.
Thank you. So I think that the shibboleth of non-alignment and the equally complex shibboleth, I might use the word carefully, of strategic autonomy, these are necessary wraps. They're necessary cloaks around fluff. They're fluff. They coat a fairly hard core of geopolitical realism, which is currently India's forte. In my addressal, I spoke at length about the need for structural issues, economic issues, so as to be able to develop collaborative approaches which do not get trapped in some zero-sum games alone. I also got the feeling from many questions that are asked that, maybe we're not, India is somewhat hesitant. So with your permission, I wanted to show you one slide.
Please go ahead, sir.
And it sort of diverts away from your specific question, but it diverts, I think, in the right direction. So I just want to show you this one or 2 slides of mine. This is the manner in which we think that we will be dealing in the military term in the maritime issues concerning China with China. So we obviously, like everybody else, and we need the Quad as a collective to do some net assessment of what we are doing and where we are going. This is something that the Quad must simply be willing and able to do. Obviously, all countries will prepare for conflict. Obviously, during the preparation, we will hone battle skills. How do we hone battle skills most of all? And what is it that we will try and do? I think if I can show you this slide and see what is the manner in which the probable battle space is going to be shaped by not just India, though this slide relates to India, but by the Quad. How are we going to conduct advanced naval exercises of the Quad without tripping over one another? How are we going to develop logistic capability to be able to bring China not to the areas where China wants to go, but to the areas where we want China to come? What is it that we want to be able to do in terms of marking, counter marking? If everybody's spoken about the Lombok Strait. Of course, we study the Lombok Strait, but are we studying it together? Are we studying it independently? Are we looking at monitoring Chinese submarine access to the Indian Ocean together? Are we doing it independently? Are we doing international cooperation within Quad? Are we exchanging technology? If the answer is no, then we should be. And those automatically mean that India might well continue its process and its statements of strategic autonomy, but India is not a pushover state who doesn't know how to operate within the areas of concern. Particularly, I want to highlight not just where Admiral Koda left off in the Lombok-Makassar Strait, but I want to emphasize the requirement for us to cooperate in the Strait of Ombai-Wetar. It is here in the Strait of Ombai-Wetar, God gave, during the Cold War, God gave the NATO forces the GUK, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. God has given us Indonesia. God has given Indonesia the Ombai-Wetar Strait. Much of our conversation at the military level ought to be focused over here. This is where we want to be able to move ASW, as Admiral Koda correctly mentioned. So it's not that India doesn't work these things and India isn't moving towards these areas. It's not that we don't know how important the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are. Each of these requires that we make haste slowly, that we carry a big stick and speak softly, as Teddy Roosevelt famously said, but that we develop opportunities to figure out what might cause an outbreak of conflict, what might be the causes of, what might be the casus bellis, and then how should we handle issues from there. I'll stop sharing, but I did want to emphasize the fact that while we continue to be concerned about the manner in which we are perceived in the region, it is not that you can manage the region by simply hard power perspectives and perception. Perception management is a tricky thing, and it is not that any one of the countries involved in the Quad have got a lane on how to do this. We need to be able to talk to one another. If cloaks are required, every magician, sir, needs his own smoke and mirrors. And it's only a poor magician who believes that his smoke and mirrors are real and that he is actually doing magic. So what should be our smoke and mirrors? Whom should we be delivering these to? These are the levels of discussion which should take place on the sidelines of the Quad, if not on the main table of the Quad. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. I'll take
General
on.
Shankar, I was just replying to your message. I think we can wrap up in 5 minutes by summarizing some of those questions on the Q&A. Because what we can do, sorry to interrupt, what we can do is there's plenty of interesting questions. We will summarize them. We'll reach out to the panelists and try and get some responses and email the attendees because we would like to try and get them to the panelists also at a later time, not just now. In the next 5 minutes, we should be able to wrap up.
Yeah, let me look at the interesting questions which have come up and I'll put it across and we'll probably elicit a response from the panelists later on. One question is there any authentic input how China looks at Quad? And will Quad influence China's behavior and how much? I think that's a fair question. We'll not answer it, but we'll just take it on and we'll get your views later on. Peter McDermott from Australia, I suppose, he says, the Quad is a series of meetings and is very effective at coordinating separate responses. But how does it become an operational alliance or operationalized alliance? That's a very interesting question, and that touches the nub of the whole equation. And I'll limit myself to these two issues where we would like considered opinions from all of you, and then we'll publish it out as a paper. So that, this business of operationalized alliance is the issue, whether it's a partnership or alliance or what it is. I think we'll have to move slowly towards that. We are, frankly speaking, we are very much out of time. So I'll just wrap it up by saying, I think we had a terrific discussion and I thought we had some great viewpoints coming out. Quad is a work in progress. It's in its initial stages. It's great that we have restarted talking of Quad 3.0. And I see a lot of value in the way we go forward. And this attempt of ours is the initial attempt to get things moving and to get problems on table. Unless you put your cards on the table and have issues on the table, you don't have a solution for them either, right? I think it's a great thing. I thank each and every one of you who have been listening on and who've spoken on this panel for your great views. Thanks a lot. With this, I'll hand you over to General Gautam Murthy to wrap it up and give his concluding remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, General Shankar. Thank you, the panelists, for this excellent webinar that we've held. The Quad is not just a talking shop, and neither would this webinar be a talking shop. So therefore, your recommendations that you've made, we will try and distill them and put it across in some kind of paper, as General Shankar has suggested. I would like to thank each and every one of you, Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, General Jerry Martinez, Admiral Yoji Koda, Professor John Blaxland, Professor Eugen Kuo, and above all, I would like to thank Mr. James Angelis of ISIC, as well as Mr. Christian Ryan, for getting you all over here, and so that we are able to discuss. I think the cooperation between ISIC and CASA will go a long way. This is just the beginning. I would also like to thank our moderator, General Shankar, for having done a fantastic job, Mr. Shankar Mahadevan, my core team, and of course, Jeffrey and Ryan Bloom. Without those help, we wouldn't have been speaking and looking at each other right through without a hitch. Last but not least, I'd like to thank the audience for your participation. And sorry for the lack of time, we are not able to take on, but be rest assured your questions have been noted and will form a part, as General Shankar said. We will be reaching out to the panelists and trying and get you some answers through email. Thank you all very much for this excellent webinar. On behalf of ISIC and CASA, thank you all. Goodbye and Godspeed. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.